Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu, filling in for Riz Khan. The growing number of Muslims living in Europe and America has raised questions about how and if this diverse community can fit into traditional Western society. Security and immigration experts in Europe often call for greater integration. In the United States, multiculturalism is the goal. At the heart of the debate is whether or not secularism and Islam are even compatible. Don't forget, we take your questions and comments on this program. The numbers are there at the bottom of your screen. Joining me now from Paris is Professor Olivier Roy, Research Director at the French National Center for Scientific Research and a lecturer at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences. In his most recent book, Secularism Confronts Islam, he discusses the link between religion and culture and how Islam is practiced in the West. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I want to ask you first about the title of your book, Secularism Confronts Islam. It appears to be a little bit of a provocative title. Is it based on a belief that Islam cannot coexist with other religions in a secular society, that there will always be tension?
Well, it's a common idea in Europe, amongst the European public opinion, that there is some sort of incompatibility between Islam and secularism. So my issue was, to which extent can we say that there is a confrontation between Islam and secularism? And the whole book is dedicated to the idea that, in fact, the issue is not so much a confrontation between Islam and secularism than, I would say, a recasting of Islam as a religion among others in Europe.
Now, in France, you don't talk about secularism. You have a unique term in French. It's laicity, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. What is the difference there?
Well, secularism is just, a social and cultural fact. The fact that religion stopped to be central in the society and that people do not care too much about religion. But the French laicity is something different. It's some sort of a political issue. It means that the French Republican state was built during, I would say, the 19th century against the Catholic Church. So our political secularism, which might be the best translation for laicity, is the result of a political struggle between the state and the Catholic Church. Not the state and religion as such, but the state and the Catholic Church. So there is some sort, in France, of general resentment against religion. The idea that religion should not be permitted to be too much represented in the public sphere. So we have a very political approach, I would say, of religion in France. So but the background is common.
I was just going to ask you, is that
it's a part of the...
Is that the French equivalent of the separation of church and state?
In legal and constitutional terms, yes. But the separation of church and state in the USA, for instance, has been created to protect the churches from the state. While in France, separation of church and state has been established to protect the state from the church. So it's a far more militant and political approach of separation of church and state.
Okay, Mr. Roy, we're already getting some callers in on this program. Let's go to Shahed in the United Kingdom. Shahed, go ahead with your call.
May I just ask your guest as to what he thinks needs to happen in terms of perhaps social or cultural evolution to bring about an ideology or a situation in the Islamic world where it might become compatible with the current Western world. What needs to happen?
Okay, Mr. Roy?
I am not sure that the issue is theological. I am not sure that we need some sort of reformation of Islam. The issue is not to have a liberal Islam which could be compatible with Western values. We have a very conservative Christianity which claims to be compatible with Western values. So I think that it's a mistake, to see the issue through the focus of theology. I think that you can be a very conservative, religious-minded individual and still be a good citizen of a secular Western state. So the issue is more about how do you recast the norms and values of religion in a modern and secular society. It's not so much about theology as such.
Is there a difference between assimilation and integration, in your view?
Yeah, surely. Assimilation means that, at least in France, you know, by assimilation we mean that religion should stop to be obvious, that religion should be kept in the private or should disappear, you know. While integration means that you could be a good citizen of any national state in the West and still retains some personal individual characteristics. My view is that both models, you know, multiculturalism in Great Britain and assimilationism in France, have failed, but they have failed for the same reasons. Both presuppose that religion and culture are to some extent the same thing, which means that in multiculturalism you keep religion, Islam, as long as you keep your culture, the pristine culture of your parents, and in France it supposes that once you become a cultural French, you stop to be a Muslim, you stop to be religious-minded. So my view is that now religion in the West, in Western Europe, is more and more disconnected, you know, with culture. Both cultures, I would say, Western cultures, European culture, as well as Middle Eastern cultures, if we can say that.
Okay, let's get in a question from one of our other viewers. Kareem from London is calling. Kareem, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, good evening. I think the title of tonight's discussion is misleading, to say the least. Muslims and Islam are not a foreign entity within Europe. Muslims and Islam have been in Europe for over 1,000 years. Muslims ruled Spain for 900 years. They're in the Balkans for over 700 years. And I think Olivier Roy really needs to look up his history, because being a Frenchman, he should know more than most that the French, the British, and other European powers had large empires within the Muslim world. And I think they know Islam very well. And what we're seeing now is an intellectual attempt to browbeat Muslims. Muslims are de facto being treated as second-class citizens in Europe. Over the last few years, we've seen Muslim women being dictated as to what type of clothes they can wear in France. In Denmark and in large parts of Europe, we saw the Islamic belief being pilloried and insulted under the guise of freedom. So I think Olivier Roy and his ilk should be a bit more introverted and look at themselves and what they represent, rather than always pointing the finger at Muslims.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that call. Mr. Roy, your response?
Yeah, there is a long tradition of interrelations between Islam and Europe, of course, both in Eastern Europe with local Muslims and through the intercolonial, the colonial relations. But in both cases, Eastern Europe and colonial relations, Muslims were seen as some sort of an ethnic groups. What we have now is the building, I would say, of a Muslim community as a faith community in Europe and not as an ethnic minority, which is something which is totally new. So Islam is now seen by the European Muslims as a religion, as a faith community, and not just as the expression of a traditional, cultural, ethnic community. Hence, the relations, with, I would say, the obvious symbols of belonging to this faith community are totally different. In the scarf affair, for instance, in France, the fact that some schoolgirls came to school wearing an Islamic veil or Islamic scarf, let's say, the issue was not that these girls were representing a traditional ethnic cultural community, but the issue was that in some extent they were born again. They were young French citizens speaking French, expressing themselves as French citizens, and wanting to come into the public sphere with obvious, ostensible signs, symbols of their faith. And this is something which, in the French atmosphere, of laicity, which is a political secularism, has been seen as some sort of a denial, of refusal of integration. While for me, on the contrary, this was a quest, for being recognized as altogether French citizen and Muslim believer. But this is something which is in the French traditions is not used, to be associated, citizenship and religious identity.
Let me ask you about those riots that took place just outside Paris not so long ago. The rioters were predominantly young Muslim youth. Was that an Islamic-based revolt in your view, or was it some kind of social protest?
First, of course, there were many young Muslims in these riots, because the suburbs where the riots occurred are mainly populated with the second and third generation of migrants. But it would be a mistake to call them Muslim riots, or to call these riots intifada, the suburbs, that has been said in many conservative newspapers in the West. In fact, it was a youth movement and a social movement. It was a generational movement. And if we look, for example, at the names of the people who have been arrested by the police, only half of the names are Muslim. So in fact, the population living in these destitute estates are more mixed than it has been said. But they share something in common, the feeling of being excluded. So these riots were not a call for being recognized as an ethnic or cultural minority. These riots were some sort of a call to be integrated, to be granted the same rights and the same perceived privileges as the mainstream population. So I would stress the social and generational dimension of these riots against the ethnic and religious background.
Okay, let's get another question in from one of our viewers. Vera in Italy is calling. Vera, what's your question?
Hello. Yes. Actually, I come from Italy, which is known as the Vatican courtyard, as you may know. Well, I think that it's the use that religious leaders put religion to that makes it incompatible. Religions as such are not incompatible, but the way they are used by religious leaders make them incompatible. And the problem, one of the major problems for us non-believers in Europe, that about half the European population does not believe. They are either atheists or agnostics or just indifferent to religion. They don't care. Well, this sort of unholy alliance that is brought about between Catholics, Muslims, I only speak of leaders, not religions as such, become extremely dangerous for secularism. That's the problem, I think, at any rate. Okay, thank you.
All right, let me put that question to Olivier Roy. Is that the case where religious leaders are using religion as a pretext for their own ends?
Well, the issue of religion and politics in Europe is, of course, far more complex than just opposing Islam and the West. Because one of the issues is, what is the West? What is Europe? And we have two definitions of Europe. One is a religious definition. Europe is Christian or Judeo-Christian. The other definition is Europe is secularism. It's a secularist entity. So our Christian religious leaders are, in fact, I would say, playing on both levels. Sometimes they advocate secularism against Islam, and sometimes they advocate the specificity of Christianism in Europe, and they try to play Christian Europe against Islam. So we have, it's true that we have a political instrumentalization of religion and of Christianity in particular in Western Europe in particular. We have sometimes a strange alliance between leftist secularists who oppose Islam because they oppose any religion, and Christian rightists who oppose Islam because it is Islam. So it doesn't contribute, of course, to make things easier.
You know, in recent years, especially after the events of 9/11, the attacks here in the United States, some Western governments, some of the Western media have been equating terrorism with Islam. It's a complaint that you hear very often from Muslim groups, from Muslim individuals. It's led to a lot of bitterness. Is that a valid complaint?
It's a current complaint, sure. Is it a valid complaint? Certainly not, because when we look at the radicals, for example, Al-Qaeda, we can see that their motivations and their claims are mostly political. You know, for me, they are more the legacy of a tradition of anti-imperialism, of ultra-left contestation of established order. They are more than the expression of a traditional Islam. We should not forget that Al-Qaeda is the Muslim, quote-unquote Muslim, of course, organization with the highest level of converts. You know. And in Al-Qaeda, converts do have responsibility. So it means that the people who join Al-Qaeda don't do that for religious reasons. You know. If they convert to Islam to join Al-Qaeda, it's because their first motivation is political violence. They go to Al-Qaeda because they are rebels who are looking for a cause. And I think that the impact, the appeal of Al-Qaeda among the youth, because Al-Qaeda is a youth movement, if I can say that, you know, it's not a mass movement. The appeal is because now Al-Qaeda is the most radical organization on the political market, if I can say that. So if you are a true radical, now you join Al-Qaeda, while 30 years ago you would have joined some sort of ultra-Marxist organization.
Okay, Mr. Roy, thank you for joining us. That's Olivier Roy talking to us there from Paris. He's the author of the book Secularism Confronts Islam. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for being with us. Tomorrow we talk to the controversial former United States ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. He's just published his memoir, Surrender is Not an Option. Join us tomorrow. In the meantime, check out our question of the week at aljazeera.net/English. We ask whether or not protesting is still relevant. We are particularly interested in getting your thoughts by video mail. See you next time. Street Talk is next.